Hi, welcome to Prime Recap. An alien parasite comes to Earth and ends up infecting a former journalist who begins to develop superpowers and an insatiable appetite for carrion as his internal organs are slowly devoured by the creature. Today we will recap the story of Venom from 2018 and Venom, Let There Be Carnage from 2021. A ship that was off Earth conducting research with extraterrestrial life forms known as symbiotes suffers some sort of security breach and ends up going into orbit at full speed, crashing into the ground with an impact force so absurd that it ends up taking the lives of the scientists and releasing one of the alien creatures. When the rescue team arrives at the crash site, they find one of the astronauts still alive and take him straight to the hospital, but this man has had his body invaded by the symbiote that escaped, and in the middle of the trip he wakes up totally insane and begins to attack the rescuers, parasitizing the body of one of the team members. A few months after the accident, Eddie Brock, a rather famous investigative reporter, is sent by his boss to do an exclusive interview with Carlton Drake, the owner of the Life Foundation, the space exploration company responsible for the rocket that crashed with the symbiotes. The broadcaster's goal is to flatter the businessman to try to clean up his image, but Eddie refuses to do this. During the night, the reporter takes advantage of his fiancée Anne's sleep and begins searching for confidential files involving Drake and the Life Foundation. Anne happens to be a lawyer, and since her law firm works for the billionaire, she has dozens of confidential files about the accident and the research conducted by the company. After spending the early morning hours investigating the cases, Eddie goes for an interview, and instead of talking about the rockets as his boss ordered, he starts accusing Drake of conducting his research on humans. After the accusation session, the billionaire throws him out of the building and uses his influence to take away the jobs of both Eddie and Anne, who, disgusted at having her life ruined by her fiancé, decides to call off the wedding and separate. At the Life Foundation, after months of doing tests with the symbionts on animals, Drake discovers that the alien creatures work like an organ donor, where the parasite and the host need to be compatible for both to live well. With this discovery, the billionaire finally decides to begin human trials to achieve symbiosis. He then convinces a homeless man to volunteer and takes him to the lab to be the first guinea pig. However, as it was obvious, the experiment goes wrong and the man ends up being devoured from the inside out in an extremely painful way by the symbiote, putting an end to his life, but Drake simply asks them to send the next guinea pig. Seeing another human being eliminated so coldly and knowing that more and more people will lose their lives as guinea pigs, the scientist Doris decides to seek out Eddie and tells him all the plans and experiments on homeless people that Drake has already carried out, but the former reporter refuses to help her gather the evidence for fear of having his life ruined once again. After Dora's visit, Eddie pays a visit to Anne's apartment and discovers that she is in another relationship with Dan, a medical surgeon. Tired of being in this limbo of failure, Eddie changes his mind and decides to call Doris. After infiltrating the building, Eddie goes to the lab while the scientist is distracting the security guards. At the study center, the former reporter begins taking various photographs of the research with the symbionts and the caged people until one of Drake's guinea pigs recognizes Eddie and begins begging for help. Trying to help her, the man takes a fire extinguisher and breaks the containment glass, causing the alarm to go off, but as soon as he manages to free her, the symbiote inside her goes berserk at the frequency of the sound and causes the woman to attack him, thus passing the parasite into the reporter's body and leaving the homeless woman lifeless. Not quite understanding what has happened, Eddie starts to run away while being chased by the security guards, but during his escape he notices that he is much stronger and much more agile than usual, managing to escape with extreme ease by climbing a very tall tree in a few seconds. Upon arriving at his apartment, Eddie begins to feel extreme hunger, and even eats a piece of rotten chicken that was in the trash can. After the bizarre meal, Eddie goes to Anne, who is in a restaurant with Dan, and tries to show her his evidence, but the symbiote begins to take over his body, causing him to act like a complete lunatic nutcase. Realizing that Eddie is totally out of control, Dan calls an ambulance and takes him to his hospital for an MRI, but during the exam he begins convulsing wildly, forcing the doctor to turn off the machine. It turns out that in addition to fire, high-frequency waves are deadly to symbionts, and had Dan not stopped the examination, most likely Eddie and the parasite would have been eliminated. At the Life Foundation facility, Drake finds out about the break-in and orders his security team to investigate what happened, but it doesn't take long for the security guards to find out about Doris' involvement. Upon finding out about his employee's betrayal, Drake meets with her and asks who it was that took the symbiont, but the scientist refuses to say. The businessman then changes his approach by trying to manipulate her by talking up the argument that the new host will be consumed alive by the parasite if they don't intervene, and Doris falls for the cheap speech, telling him that the one with the symbiont is Eddie. With the information he wanted, Drake releases one of the parasites that consumes the scientist's organs, slowly and painfully taking her life. With the information, the billionaire orders his men to go to Eddie's house to capture him, but the symbiont does not intend to surrender and begins to attack the soldiers, knocking them all out with extreme ease. As more men arrive, Eddie rushes to his motorcycle and begins to flee while blasting his pursuers with the symbiote's powers, but the crazy man becomes overconfident and in a moment of carelessness is hit by one of the cars that knocks him off his bike and causes compound fractures all over his body, leaving him totally immobile. With his bones all but destroyed, Eddie is picked up by one of Drake's men, but the symbiote heals all of the man's fractures and takes control of his body, transforming him into an extremely gruesome-looking alien that begins to lick the man's face and devours the head of one of the military men as if it were a simple breakfast. As soon as the police arrive, the symbiont starts running and jumps into the sea, escaping to the middle of the ocean where he introduces himself as Venom. After explaining what he is, the symbiote tells Eddie that Drake has built another rocket and that this time his plan is to bring all the millions of symbiotes that exist to Earth to use in his experiments on humans, but Venom says that if Drake does this, the others of his kind will not be subordinate to Drake and will devour the entire planet until there is nothing left. Before going to the rocket, Eddie stops by his old job and scales the building like a Spider-Man, until he reaches the office of his former boss. He then leaves his cell phone with all the pictures he took in the lab, proving all the accusations he made that caused his dismissal. As Eddie comes down from the building, he is surrounded by special agents who start firing gas rounds, but Venom takes control and manages to eliminate each of the military, but just as he was about to devour the head of the last man, Anne appears and, scared, forces Eddie to return to his original form, preventing him from making his snack. She then tells the reporter that Dan wants to run some more tests and takes him to the hospital. While all this was going on, that other symbiont that managed to escape during the accident was parasitizing various bodies until he found out about Drake's plans and used a little girl as his host to take him to the businessman, thus possessing his body. At the hospital, Dan tells Eddie that Venom is slowly consuming his organs while inside him, but the symbiote is not at all happy to have his secret revealed and becomes so furious that he attacks the doctor. Anne takes advantage of his weakness against high-frequency waves and manages to get the alien out of Eddie's body and trap him in a room, but Venom manages to get out through the air pipe and parasitize the body of a poor dog. Not imagining that the symbiote has managed to escape, Eddie decides to go home, but is captured while still in the hospital elevator and taken to the Life Foundation headquarters by Drake's men. Venom then goes to Anne with his canine host and possesses the woman's body. In Drake's office, Riot takes over and threatens Eddie to get Venom's location, but since the reporter doesn't know where he is, the businessman decides to just dispose of him and orders his men to take him into the middle of the forest to finish him off. However, Venom emerges from the trees possessing Anne's body and saves the reporter by devouring the military's head. After returning to Eddie, the symbiont assumes his original form and begins running toward the spaceship to destroy it. In the operations room, Drake starts the rocket launch count, but when he realizes that one of his employees wants to abort the mission, he assumes the form of Riot and throws the scientist against the wall, impaling his body and generating widespread chaos in the place. With his plan underway, Riot begins to run toward the rocket, but is stopped by Venom, who challenges him to a battle and gives him a tie, but the villain manages to get rid of it easily by making some thorns appear from his back. As the fight progresses, Venom takes too many hits and is completely outnumbered, separated from Eddie and left completely defenseless. At that moment, Riot manages to absorb all of them and runs to the rocket, but at that moment Anne manages to enter the launching room and activates a frequency wave so high that it separates the symbiotes from the humans. On the platform, Eddie manages to knock Drake out with a single punch and knock him into the sea with a kick. However, Riot manages to merge back into the businessman's body and drives a stake through the torso of the reporter, who lies agonizing on the ground as he enters the rocket. When Eddie is almost completely lifeless, Venom finally catches up with him and possesses his body, healing his wounds at the last second. He then scales the rocket that was already leaving Earth and uses the blade that was in his chest to destroy the spaceship, causing a huge fireball that chars Drake and Riot together, but the flames also hit Venom, who almost loses his life by turning into a parachute to save Eddie. So now let's move on to the events of Venom, Let It Be Carnage. A few weeks after the battle, the reporter managed to get back into the world of journalism, and as his first interview, Eddie decides to talk to Cletus Cassidy, a psychopath accused of dozens of killings. Although everyone is completely sure that Cletus took several lives, none of the bodies have been found, and because of this he cannot be sentenced. For some reason, Cassidy has become fond of Eddie and constantly invites him to visit him on death row, teasing the reporter and giving him little details of his dark past. At the same time, the police put more and more pressure on Eddie to tell them all the information he can from this lunatic. After another visit to the prisoner where he asks Eddie to write a seemingly random message in the paper, Venom identifies some strange drawings on the wall of his cell, and when he gets home, he quickly identifies one of the drawings as being of a beach in California. Once the cops arrive on the scene to investigate, they find several bodies of Cletus victims, thus getting enough evidence to sentence him to lethal injection. With this, Eddie is finally able to become successful as a reporter again, but upon finding out that Anne is marrying Dan, he begins to feel extremely empty and sad, even trying to take his own life with his motorcycle. Feeling a little better the next morning, Eddie receives a letter by post from Cletus inviting him to one last conversation before his execution, and even though he is still a little shaken, the reporter decides to go and maybe get a confession or a little of the man's story. Upon arriving at the prison, Eddie starts having a completely crazy conversation with the man who soon starts offending him, but Venom is totally furious with Cletus and attacks him, throwing him back and forth inside the cell. Cassidy then takes Eddie's hand and bites down with all his might, thus tearing off a piece of venom that the prisoner swallows like a real alien appetizer. Unaware that Cassidy has ingested some of Venom, Eddie goes home and starts arguing with the symbiote for getting out of hand and wasting the last chance to get a confession out of the criminal. But the argument quickly turns into a real fight, with Venom breaking the reporter's nose with a headbutt and choking him shortly thereafter. Eddie then strikes back by hitting the symbiote in the head with a helmet, which ends up breaking his teeth. After completely destroying the house, Venom decides to leave and abandon Eddie, but before he leaves he possesses the body of a homeless man and completely crushes the reporter's motorcycle. After leaving the apartment, Venom ends up in the middle of a costume party where he is a big hit due to his appearance and becomes a real attraction, including a motivational speech. At the same time in the prison, Cletus is strapped to a stretcher and slowly, the lethal injection is applied to his body, but the chemicals begin to react with the venom cells he ingested, and because of this, the criminal ends up transforming into Carnage, an extremely powerful symbiote. Inside the prison, the new alien begins to spread chaos by freeing the prisoners and causing a real carnage by taking the lives of all the prison guards with his new powers, thus achieving his long-dreamed-of escape. In his apartment, Eddie sees on the news about Cletus' escape, and already knowing that the criminal will go after him, he starts listening to the recordings he made of his last conversation to try to predict the lunatic's next move. And while he is looking at the sketches Venom made of the drawings on the wall of his cell, Eddie sees that he drew the St. Estes orphanage, a place that functioned almost like a sanatorium for children. But what is the villain's link to this place? Well, after taking the lives of his grandmother and mother when he was little, Cassidy ended up in the orphanage and met a girl named Frances Barrison, a little metahuman who has such powerful vocal cords that she is able to destroy hearing with a single scream. Cletus and Frances quickly fell in love and developed a loving relationship over the years until she was transferred to a psychiatric institute for mutants known as Ravencroft, and Cassidy escaped to commit his crimes, thus building his reputation as a sociopath. In St. Estes, Eddie begins to explore the site, which is now completely abandoned, until he finds carved into a tree a heart with CK+FB, the initials of Cletus and Frances. With this discovery, Eddie immediately calls Detective Mulligan, the policeman responsible for the Cassidy hunt and also the man who took the sight out of Frances' left eye. Knowing well the case of the two, Mulligan immediately assumes that Cletus is going to rescue his beloved. Finally free on the streets, Cassidy steals a convertible car and uses it to drive to a convenience store where he beats up the cashier so he can use Carnage's abilities to hack into the police system, thus managing to discover that Frances is being held at the Ravencroft Institute. At the sanatorium, the principal comes to warn the villain about Cletus' escape and teases her that he will never get her out of there, but as soon as she finishes her teasing, Cassidy appears already inside the cell and uses Carnage's powers to strangle the woman and destroy the cube where Frances is trapped, finally freeing her beloved after so many years. Carnage then leads them to the car and destroys the pursuing vehicles. Trying to help, Frances uses her powers to try to bring down the helicopter, but she shoots out sound waves so strong that they nearly take the life of the symbiote, who angrily says that if Frances screams one more time, he will eliminate her. After escaping, Cletus and Frances begin planning their wedding, and each of them chooses the gift they want for the ceremony. The villain chooses Mulligan for taking away her vision. Cassidy chooses Eddie because he is responsible for his doom, and Carnage chooses Venom because he wants to be the only symbiote on the planet. After what happened at the Ravencroft Institute, Mulligan asks Eddie to go to the police station, and after making several accusations, the policeman tells him about the monster that is with Cletus, making the reporter immediately understand that Cassidy now also has a symbiote. With this information, Eddie tells Anne about Cletus and asks her to look for Venom, as only he can defeat Carnage. But it turns out that the alien who is now in the body of a convenience store owner is still very upset with Eddie and refuses to help him. Anne then uses her power of persuasion to massage the symbiote's ego and manages to convince him to enter her body and together go to Eddie. When Venom arrives at the police station, he springs into action and rescues the reporter, leaving a hole in the wall, but before merging with him again, the alien forces Eddie to apologize and finally make up. Knowing what Cassidy is capable of, Eddie asks Dan and Ann to pack their things and leave town as quickly as possible while he tries to track down the villain, but the couple doesn't even have time to try to escape. While Dan is loading his things, Francis comes up behind him and manages to knock him out with extreme ease, entering the apartment and capturing Ann shortly thereafter, but before she leaves she hands the wedding invitation to the doctor and orders him to give it to Venom. As soon as Francis leaves, Dan immediately calls Eddie and tells him that they have taken Ann, as well as giving him the address that was on the invitation. Across town, Mulligan is driving through the streets until he encounters Cletus and decides to try to arrest him himself, a not very smart idea. Carnage then uses his mutant abilities and manages to capture the policeman. Arriving at the ceremony site, which is a cathedral still under renovation, Venom and Carnage start advancing against each other. Carnage then hits her with a supreme mega slap and orders her to stop screaming, but Cassidy is enraged at the symbiote for assaulting the woman and tries to get loose. However, the alien pulls him back into it. With no more obstacles, Venom sets off on his enemy and manages to knock him to the ground with a wrestling blow, but Carnage quickly gets up looking like the girl from The Exorcist and pins Venom against the wall using some darts. With his enemy trapped, Carnage catches Francis, who is about to take Mulligan's life, and orders her to use her powers to kill Venom, but while they are arguing the cop manages to run and uses the elevator to go to the top of the building to call for reinforcements. However, he is followed by Francis, who shoves a tool into his back and begins to crush his eye to take his vision away just as he did to her. After this, Francis ties a chain around Mulligan's neck and hits a volley into the chest of the policeman, who collapses breathless as he falls against some steel bars. Downstairs, Carnage catches the priest with his tentacles and devours the poor guy's head, which makes him bigger and stronger as if he had eaten a Mario mushroom. Venom manages to push the villain away, and Dan, who has just arrived at the place, takes the opportunity to set the alien on fire with gasoline and a blowtorch, but this only serves to make him the villain's target. Carnage then goes over to the doctor and holds him down with his tentacles as he prepares to disembowel him, but Venom manages to get rid of the darts and holds the symbiote by the neck, preventing him from eating the doctor's head. At that moment, the church bell begins to ring and the vibration of the wave causes the two aliens to lose their strength momentarily, leaving Eddie and Cletus in a face-to-face fight. Being an insane psychopath, Cassidy gets the upper hand in the grappling and, after hitting a kick to the reporter's face, uses a plastic bag to choke Eddie. But at that moment the bell stops ringing and Venom can finally fight back, throwing Carnage away. After a few more moments of fighting, the villain ends up hitting Venom with a critical blow that goes back into Eddie's body. Cletus then picks up a sledgehammer and uses the tool to land several blows on the reporter, breaking his knees. Before finishing the fight, Carnage catches Ann, who is gagged, and decides to eliminate her in front of Eddie, but Francis disapproves of the attitude and asks Cletus not to do it. The symbiote then uses its tentacles to silence the woman and says that it will eliminate her as well, but Cassidy refuses to do so and tries to separate himself from Carnage. Lying on the ground, Venom sees the whole scene and realizes that they are not compatible and that it is therefore easier to separate them. He then gets up and goes to the top of the church, where he drives a steel stake through the symbiote's head, but it is not very effective. With Ann about to fall, Venom uses his last strength to save the woman while the villain uses his tentacles to pierce his heart. As a last resort, Venom throws Francis off the top of the church, which begins to crumble. While falling, the woman screams louder than ever, which ends up separating the humans from their symbiotes during the fall. Venom then bridges the gap between Dan and Ann's bodies and manages to get to the ground before Eddie does, cushioning his fall. Cassidy, on the other hand, is not so lucky and has his bones completely fractured on impact. On the ground, Carnage in his original form begins to crawl to Cletus, however Venom quickly steps on the symbiote and devours him in one go. I don't even want to imagine what that tastes like. In his final moments, Cassidy begins to give his psychopathic speech, but Venom has no patience and devours the nutcase's head while he is still talking, adding him to his list of unknowns. Finally, since they are being sought by the police, Eddie and Venom decide to take refuge in the middle of a deserted island until the dust settles. And so ends the career of the lethal protector Venom temporarily. So what did you think of this movie? Leave it in the comments below. And if you liked the video, please like and subscribe for more movie recaps. See you next time.